the way they came back the second game, it just makes you excited to, okay, I want to be a part of that. They didn't lay down and quit. They came back and actually try to beat us early, that next game. So it just shows a lot about their character and how hungry they are, and I want to be a part of that.
For weeks, the Indiana Fever fan base has been under attack. The narrative? They're toxic, hostile, and driving players away. Cheryl Swoopes even claimed that WNBA players wanted nothing to do with Indiana.
It's a lot. So you have players that are very significant on this Indiana Fever team that are like, I don't
want to be here.
This is where I want to be.
Yeah. Now listen,
what you said, there's a lot of shit. What kind of things you said?
I'm not in the locker room.
Okay. I'm
talking about more social media.
Okay.
But out of nowhere, a respected veteran, a WNBA champion, and a future Hall of Famer just shattered that claim with one tweet. And in doing so, she may have just turned the entire conversation on its head. When Cheryl Swoopes made her bold claim about Indiana's fan base, it immediately fueled an already growing debate.
This WNBA offseason killed a lot of dumbass narratives, right? It really did. And I hope they're gone for good. And I hope we spend so much less time discussing nonsense. But I think we've seen it stamped out this offseason. And one of those narratives was people wouldn't want to go to the Fever because of the Fever fan.
Fever fans had been labeled toxic ever since Caitlin Clark arrived, with critics arguing that their passionate support bordered on hostility. And for a while, it seemed like that narrative was gaining traction. Media figures ran with the idea. Former WNBA players echoed it, and skeptics began to question whether Indiana Fever fans were crossing the line.
People on social media calling her every name under the sun because she chose to play in Indiana. These are the same people that are like, oh, she'll never play in Indiana for obvious reasons. And she went and defended the Indiana fans and was like, talking about, she was basically like, talking positively about the fans that were interacting with her positively, and was responding to one of the crazy posts about her being like, I'm getting screenshots of things you were saying about.
But then, DeWanna Bonner, a 5-time All-Star and 2-time WNBA champion, decided enough was enough. With one simple tweet, Bonner shut the conversation down. She completely rejected the idea that Indiana's fan base was toxic, calling it one of the most passionate and engaged groups in the league. And just like that, the entire debate flipped on its head. Fever fans who had spent weeks feeling vilified saw Bonner's statement as validation.
DeWanna Bonner being olive branch to us all to focus on the basketball. But I did think it was worth sharing simply because I know a lot of those fans, the new fans, felt rejected and beaten down a lot.
They rallied behind her, flooding social media with support. Suddenly, instead of being framed as the problem, Indiana's fan base became the story of resilience, loyalty, and undeniable passion. And here's the twist. Bonner wasn't just defending the fans. She was, in a way, defending Caitlin Clark. Because ever since Clark entered the league, criticism of Indiana's fan base has also felt like indirect criticism of her. Every negative comment, every accusation of toxicity was ultimately tied to the fact that Clark had transformed Indiana into the WNBA's most watched team overnight.
Being painted with this broad brushstroke was always just stupid, really. There's no other word for it, because Caitlin Clark brought more fans to the league than it's ever seen. So many of them are Fever fans, and the new fans that come in outnumber the old fans that were already there.
Therefore, Bonner's statement did more than just reject a false narrative. It exposed the massive disconnect between what some in the media were saying and what actual players in the league believed.
Listen, Cheryl Swoopes is MIA. They got a APB out for Cheryl Swoopes. If you see Cheryl Swoopes, she did a lot of talking a few months ago about the Indiana Fever, the locker room environment, how people didn't want to play.
And it forced people to ask an uncomfortable question. If Indiana's fan base is so toxic, why do players keep defending them? DeWanna Bonner's tweet was met with overwhelming engagement, but more importantly, it planted a seed of doubt in the mainstream narrative. Suddenly, the idea that players didn't want to play in Indiana wasn't looking so strong anymore. But Bonner wasn't done. She had another point to make, one that exposed a major double standard in how WNBA fan bases are treated. After shutting down the toxic fan base narrative, DeWanna Bonner took things even further. She called out something that WNBA fans had been noticing for months, a clear double standard in how certain fan bases are treated. Indiana Fever fans have been under constant scrutiny since Caitlin Clark's arrival. Their passion has been reframed as hostility. Their support has been twisted into toxicity. And every incident, whether it's a heated moment in a game or a viral social media debate, has been used to paint them as a problem. But here's the contradiction. Other WNBA fan bases display the same kind of passion, yet they're celebrated for it. Las Vegas Aces fans? Electric. New York Liberty fans? Dedicated. Chicago Sky fans? Intense. But when Indiana fans show up in full force, the narrative suddenly shifts to negativity.
Felt unwelcome as a result of that, because when you look at every sport and every fan base, there are going to be bad apples. With every group of people, there are. And the larger that group becomes, of course, then the larger the small percentage of bad apples are. But if you've ever followed sports, you see people acting stupid online or even live.
Bonner called it out. She pointed to the fact that players love playing in front of engaged, rowdy crowds. She reminded everyone that loud, passionate fan bases are the backbone of every successful sports league. And most importantly, she made it clear, Indiana's fans aren't the problem. The way they're being talked about is. This wasn't just a WNBA issue. The hypocrisy resonated across sports. It tapped into the long-running debate about how different players and teams are treated, depending on who they are and where they play. And there was another layer to this. Bonner's comments tied directly into the ongoing conversation about media bias toward Caitlin Clark. The same voices criticizing Fever fans had also spent months picking apart Clark's every move. Whether it was her playing style, her attitude, or even her celebrations, Clark had been under a microscope since stepping into the WNBA. Bonner's words fueled the growing belief that something bigger was at play, that it wasn't just about Indiana, that it wasn't just about Clark, that there was a deliberate effort to control the narrative around the WNBA's biggest story. And then, the situation took an even more dramatic turn, because if Indiana Fever fans were truly so toxic, why were star players lining up to join the team? For months, critics had been pushing one idea. WNBA players didn't want to play in Indiana. They pointed to past struggles, small market disadvantages, and of course, the so-called toxic fan base. But then something happened that completely shattered that narrative. Star players didn't just choose to play for the Fever. They lined up to be part of what's being built in Indiana.
It was very clear that, like, that potential for stardom, which she never had in her career, no matter how good she's been, outweighed, like, any potential, like, downsides of playing for the Fever. And then for DeWanna Bonner, she had all those connections to Indiana. She had connections to Stephanie White.
DeWanna Bonner, a two-time WNBA champion and one of the most respected veterans in the league, made the bold decision to sign with Indiana in free agency. But she wasn't alone. Natasha Howard, a former Defensive Player of the Year, Sophie Cunningham, a fan-favorite sharpshooter, Sydney Colson, a respected veteran presence. They all chose Indiana. They weren't avoiding it. They were embracing it. And this wasn't just about basketball. This was a power shift. For years, the WNBA's biggest free agent signings centered around teams like Las Vegas, New York, and Seattle. Those were the glamour destinations. The teams that got the big names, the big contracts, and the big TV ratings. Indiana, they weren't even in the conversation. But now, that's changed. Because suddenly, playing in Indiana isn't just about winning games. It's about being part of something historic. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention to the Fever. She made them the most watched team in the league. Indiana's games consistently pull in record viewership numbers. Their jersey sales are off the charts. Their arena is packed every single night. And here's the part the critics don't want to admit. Playing for Indiana now means more exposure, more branding opportunities, and a bigger spotlight than almost any other WNBA franchise. That's why Bonner and Howard made the move. That's why the Fever's front office was able to recruit key players. And that's why the idea that nobody wants to play in Indiana is now completely dead. But the story doesn't stop there, because Bonner's decision to sign with the Fever didn't just shock the league, it also created an unexpected twist in her own personal life. DeWanna Bonner's decision to join the Indiana Fever was already shaking up the WNBA, but what no one expected was how her own wife would be at the center of the controversy. Bonner is married to Alyssa Thomas, a superstar for the Connecticut Sun. And just months before Bonner made her move to Indiana, Thomas made headlines for blasting Fever fans. After a heated matchup with Indiana, Thomas publicly stated, "In my 11-year career, I've never experienced the racial comments I've received from Indiana Fever fans."
In my 11-year career, I've never experienced the racial comments from the Indiana Fever fan base. We had her face on a serious matter that happened in this world, and it's unacceptable, honestly. And there's no place for it, and we've been professional throughout the whole entire thing, but I've never been called the things that I've been called on social media, and there's no place for it. And basketball is headed in a great direction, but nah, we don't want fans that are going to degrade us and call us racial names. I mean, we already see what's happening in the world and what we have to deal with in that aspect. And we come to play basketball for our job and it's fun, but we don't want to go to work every day and have social media blown up over things like that. It's uncalled for, and something needs to be done, whether it's them checking their fans or this league checking. There's no time for it anymore.
It was a strong statement, one that only added fuel to the ongoing debate about Fever fans, and for many, it felt like confirmation that the toxicity narrative was real. But then, in a shocking twist, Bonner chose to sign with the Fever, the very team whose fan base her wife had just accused of racism. And to make things even more dramatic, Bonner openly defended Indiana fans, completely contradicting Thomas's claim. This wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was real-life relationship drama playing out in the middle of a major WNBA controversy. Fans immediately picked up on the tension. How could Bonner, one of the league's most respected veterans, call Indiana's fan base passionate and welcoming, while her own wife had accused them of being hostile? Speculation began swirling. Did Bonner and Thomas disagree behind the scenes about what really happened? Was Bonner subtly calling out Thomas's statement without directly mentioning her? And most importantly, how would this affect the Fever versus Sun rivalry going forward? Because here's the reality. Bonner and Thomas will now face off multiple times this season, and every time they do, this storyline is going to follow them. But this situation also points to something bigger, because Bonner's decision to defend Indiana and join the Fever wasn't just about shutting down criticism, it was about being part of a movement that's bigger than any one player. The Indiana Fever aren't just another WNBA team anymore. They've become something much bigger. Just a year ago, Indiana was one of the league's least relevant franchises. Their games barely made national headlines. Their attendance numbers were struggling. Their roster was in the middle of a rebuild. But now, the Fever are the biggest attraction in women's basketball. And it all started with Caitlin Clark. Clark didn't just bring talent to the Fever, she brought an entire movement with her.
So many players decided they were going to go to the Indiana Fever in the offseason, which was the death knell for a lot of those narratives. They weren't traded. Cunningham was traded there, but Natasha Howard signed with the Indiana Fever. And I think more importantly, DeWanna Bonner signing with the Indiana Fever was representative of that. Sydney Colson as well, of course. But Bonner, because she is, in a relationship with Alyssa Thomas, and Alyssa Thomas had said what she said about fans after the playoff loss, it goes to show you that I think hopefully all that stuff has been put in the rear view. And of course, Bonner is a pro.
The moment she was drafted, Indiana became must-watch television. Their games started breaking viewership records. Their jersey sales skyrocketed. Their home games became sellouts. And this isn't just hype. It's a total shift in how the WNBA operates. For years, teams like Las Vegas, New York, and Seattle dominated the league's marketing. The biggest stars played in the biggest cities. That was the formula. But suddenly, a small market team in Indiana was at the center of everything, and players were noticing. DeWanna Bonner's decision to join the Fever wasn't just about basketball, it was a statement. It showed that Indiana isn't just an underdog story anymore. They're a powerhouse in the making. Natasha Howard's arrival reinforced that. Sophie Cunningham's signing added to the momentum, and suddenly, playing for the Fever became one of the most exciting opportunities in the league. But this movement isn't just about star players choosing Indiana. It's about how the Fever have become the biggest disruptors in WNBA history. Because let's be clear, the media didn't build this. The WNBA didn't plan this. This entire phenomenon is happening because the fans demanded it. Fever fans didn't just support Caitlin Clark, they turned her into the most marketable star the league has ever seen. They made sure every Indiana game was a must-watch event. And now, players want to be part of it. The same people who once claimed nobody wants to play in Indiana are now watching top-tier talent willingly sign with the Fever. The same voices that criticized the fan base are now seeing sold-out arenas and record-breaking TV ratings. Therefore, the real question isn't whether the Fever are changing the WNBA, it's how far this movement will go. DeWanna Bonner's arrival didn't just strengthen Indiana's roster, it changed the perception of the entire franchise. The toxic fan base narrative shut down. The claim that players don't want to play in Indiana proven wrong. The idea that Caitlin Clark's impact was overhyped, completely destroyed. And yet, there's still one massive question hanging over all of this. With all the momentum, all the star power, and all the hype surrounding the Fever, can they actually win it all? Because now, there are no more excuses. The talent is there, the attention is there, the expectations are sky high. And if Indiana proves the doubters wrong again, the WNBA will never be the same.